We are, of course, at that very happy conclusion to the account of the Passion that's provided by Luke. We've worked through, if you recall, the last half of Luke, beginning, a little more than half actually, beginning in chapter 9, in which Jesus goes to Jerusalem. You may recall the kind of thumbnail outline we've had. He goes to the city. That's a time of preparation, especially teaching those who are his followers. And the way Luke describes it, it's all of these people who are with him in Galilee who then are following him to Jerusalem. These are the ones, his inner core disciple, and then a large body of people along with them. And so most of the journey to Jerusalem is instruction about the kingdom, instruction about discipleship, instruction about coming judgment. And you may recall all of those themes we looked at earlier. Then the second part, to the cross. That's Passion Week. The focus in that section is more Jesus in his conflict with the established leadership, which he intends to overthrow, but not quite the way that some of his followers had anticipated. He will win by appearing to lose, of course, at the cross. And then the final section, to the crown. And that's the chapter we're in right now. So the culmination of Luke's gospel is the Ascension. I've suggested to you that my own view is that Luke intends a chiasm between Luke on the one hand and Acts on the other. They're kind of mirror images of each other. So while all the motion goes to Jerusalem in Luke, it goes away from Jerusalem in Acts. And the pivot point right in the middle is the Ascension. So the last event in Luke is the first event in Acts. They overlap each other. And then it's, in a sense, you see everything going back to the world, and we see a little hint of that even in our text today. So, had I not already done Acts 3 or 4 years ago, we'd just go right into Acts, you see, but we've already done that, and so we're going to jump to different material next year instead. But let's go ahead and take a look at this. We're at Luke 24, beginning, we'll start at verse 28. The Word of God. And they drew near to the village where they were going, and he made as if he was going to go further. But they constrained him, saying, "Remain with us, because the evening is coming, and the day is spent." And he entered to remain with them. And it came about, as they were sitting down to have dinner, that he took bread, and blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they said to one another, "Didn't our hearts flame within us as he was talking to us along the way and explaining to us the Scriptures?" And they rose up at that very hour and went straight back to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11 and those with them, who immediately said, "The Lord is indeed risen and has appeared to Simon." And they explained what had happened along the way, and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So there's our first paragraph. Let's ask God's blessing on our consideration of it. Father, we are grateful once again for this rich and wonderful reminder right here at the conclusion of Luke's gospel of the way in which you are made known to us in the breaking of the bread. We're so grateful that you have not left us without that tangible, palpable, continuing witness of your presence in our lives. We pray that as we reflect now on this conclusion of this great gospel, that you would, through your Spirit, guide our conversation, that our thoughts together would be honoring to Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Well, I notice you're all doing fine. You're going to pass Sunday school. But there are no A students here. So it's just, hate to say that, but nobody's failing, though. You're not going to be held back. I hope you will come back, but you're not going to be held back. So the travelers along the way, they drew near to the village, of course, Emmaus, where they were going, and Jesus made as if he was going to go further. This is very consistent with that ancient Near Eastern kind of hospitality ethic. Much more than we have in our culture, where we have a wonderful network of Holiday Inns and motels and hotels and so on. They didn't quite have something like that. Even their inns were much more rude. They didn't have the same kind of amenities and so on, obviously, that we would. And it was taken for granted that if it was at all possible to extend hospitality to a traveler, you would do that. That was just part of the ethic, and it was a very high and important aspect of the ancient cultural practice. However, the person who needed the hospitality was expected not to impose. And so Jesus is doing exactly what would be customary in that day. He makes as if he's going to keep going right down the road into the night, and the expectation is that the people in a position to extend hospitality will do so quite insistently. And that's exactly what we have here. So he made as if he was going to go on down the road, and they constrained him, a strong word, saying, "Remain with us, because the evening is here, the day is spent." So all of that very reflective of how you would expect it to take place. And I think part of what Luke wants us to understand is that even the risen Christ is still human. There's a humanity about him that Luke will continue to emphasize. He doesn't come back as some sort of phantom, some sort of hyper-spiritual being. There is a very concrete reality to this risen Christ, and we're going to see Luke emphasize that all the way through. And this is just the first little hint of it, this fact that Christ still, even in his resurrected state, is still, behaving according to the cultural norms of the day. So, based on that, he enters with them, and then enters into the place where they are. In verse 30, then, it came about, as they were sitting down to dinner, that he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. We cannot help but see in those words, of course, the Last Supper, and the very words that we're going to find repeated later in the New Testament describing the celebration of the Lord's Supper. He took bread, blessed it, and broke it. We know that this is the moment when they recognize him. But somehow the very way that Jesus conducts himself at this point sort of registers with them. That seems to be the idea. We don't know quite how Jesus transformed himself from the guest to the host. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it. Those are the things the host would do. My suspicion is it was just his personal gravitas at the point, that here he is, and that he's already registered with these guys, his deep insight into the Scriptures. For whatever reason, he plays the role then of the host, and then we have these remarkable words. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he, the Greek word aphanitos, just vanished, just was not, right out of their sight. What is Luke saying to us? He tells this story, I think, which, not that it didn't happen as reported, but he tells it this way in order to give us this distinct impression about the Lord's Supper. I want you to think for a moment that you were there and you were one of those disciples, and Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it and breaks it and hands it to you, and you take the bread from his hands and you look up, and in that moment that you're holding this bread that has just been in his hands, and you look at him and you recognize him, and he's gone. And think about the significance that's all of a sudden attached to the bread. He just handed it to you. You know he was there because the bread is in your hands. Proof positive. This was not a phantom, a hallucination. He was really there because the proof is right there in that bread in your hands, and he's gone. And now you hang on to him, as it were, in that bread. He's just placed it in your hands, And think how the importance of that bread is instantly elevated as you think, this Christ just placed this in my hands. That is sort of the way we should be thinking about the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. When we come and celebrate the Lord's Supper, we are handed bread. And we take that bread, oftentimes with the reminder from the one giving it to us, this is the Lord's body, and so on. We take that bread, and there should be in our minds the same kind of state of mind as if we had just received that from the hand of Christ himself, you see. Can you see that? Can you see that bread was just handed to me by Christ? And how powerful is the impact of that on each one of us as we envision that. He's just given it to me. He's gone, but this bread now is in my hands. Most commentators just cannot resist understanding that Luke is teaching us here about the Lord's Supper. We don't have Christ with us in this physical human form, as you're well aware. What do we have? We have him in the sacrament. And Luke wants to drive that point home to us with as much emphasis as he can. We have him. He's just handed himself to us in the breaking of the bread. And so they recognized him. He's gone. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he spoke to us along the way, explaining to us the Scriptures?" We in our Presbyterian tradition try to hold in a kind of balance two great themes related to the ministry of the church, and we call them word and sacrament. We ordain, as you know, ministers to the ministry of word and sacrament. And we want those two to be up there as the kind of centerpiece of what we understand is the ministry of Christ to us in the church. And in a sense, we hear Luke trying to drive that home. Didn't our hearts burn within to us as he spoke to us? There's the word. Along the way he was speaking, and there was that deep sense of his word burning in my heart as I heard it. But they didn't really recognize his immediate personal presence until the breaking of the bread. It was that, in a sense, that sealed the deal. It was that made them know this was Christ. This wasn't just a philosopher. This just wasn't some nice thoughts from some wise person. This was the Lord himself who now has touched me. And all of those words he said are given much greater weight by virtue of that personal touch. And that's the way we've understood it. We know in the history of the church there are traditions. I don't mean to be critical, but just to help us understand our own tradition. There have been traditions that go off kind of in the direction of the Catholic Church, which place much more emphasis on the sacrament, but we fear lose a little bit of the word. So it's not uncommon to go to a Mass and just receive the sacrament without any word. We say, no, it's word and sacrament, Other traditions really neglect the sacrament and put all the emphasis on the word. The preaching is the centerpiece. And we say, well, no, there still needs to be that handshake at the end. There needs to be that personal touch. Calvin said that the word is primary and the sacrament is secondary. That's sometimes been misunderstood. He didn't mean the word is important and the sacrament unimportant. He meant the word is first in time and then the sacrament follows. Like a conversation, as you may recall last week, ending with a handshake, You have the conversation. You have that interaction. Our hearts burn within us, and then we touch. And the touch doesn't add content, but it certainly adds ballast. The weight, the solemnity of what's happened is confirmed to us, and we see him in the breaking of the bread. So it does seem that Luke is trying to communicate something like that in the way that he tells the story. And so, of course, these guys are, all of a sudden, their whole outlook is changed radically and abruptly. Verse 33, and they rose up at that very hour and returned to Jerusalem and found gathered together the 11 and those with them. I have a feeling their trip back to Jerusalem was a little more rapid than their trip out to Emmaus. But notice they come back to Jerusalem. Jesus goes after them as they're walking away, and he turns them around. I am so glad that Jesus turns us around. Has he ever turned you around? Boy, how many times have I tried to walk away and he turns me around, sometimes rather abruptly, sometimes somewhat painfully, to be honest with you. But, it happens, doesn't it? He turns us around. He turns these guys around, brings them back, and they gather together the 11, who before they could even give their news, declare to them that the Lord is indeed risen and has appeared to Simon. Interesting. The gospel accounts make it clear that Jesus appeared to Simon, yet none of them tells us exactly when or where. The first time we ever actually hear a story of Jesus appearing to Simon is, the breakfast by the sea, when Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" And we have that interaction, you recall, in John's gospel. And yet they clearly describe this moment. Paul himself is aware of that, and you recall in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about the resurrection of Christ, and he says, "I delivered to you what was of first importance. Jesus died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, was buried, rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures, and was seen by Cephas," Peter, Simon, then by the 12, then by more than 500, most of whom still remain with us to this day, though some have died. And then he says, "And finally to me, as one born out of due season," referring to Paul himself. So clearly, we have this record that Jesus appeared to Simon, but we don't have any particular description of it exactly. We just have this reference to it. So then these fellows respond and just make known what had happened to them along the way. And then this final phrase, "and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread." How he was made known to them there. So that's the end of the story then of the road to Emmaus. And the next story really continues the same scene in which Jesus himself shows up. This is the most fun paragraph of all, and it goes like this. As they were still talking about these things, he himself stood in their midst and said to them, "Hi." They were, how can I put this, aghast and fearful, thinking they were seeing a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Why are all these thoughts arising in your hearts? You see my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you clearly see I have." And when he'd said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still disbelieving from absolute joy and astonishment, he said to them, "What you got to eat?" And they handed him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it right in front of them. Most commentators, even there are many biblical commentators who don't believe a word of it. They just like the Bible, and even commentators who are critical, suspicious, disbelieving, grant that what Luke wants us to get out of this is that this is a real human being. This is the real Lord Jesus, back from the dead, not a spook, not a phantom, not a hallucination, not some kind of collective, imagination of them, but this is a real, concrete expression of the risen Lord there among his people. And that seems to be the main purpose of this text. While they were talking about these things, he himself stood in their midst. Again, I don't want to push the point too far, but it is interesting that both times now in chapter 24 that Jesus actually shows up is when people are talking about him. On the road to Emmaus, these guys are walking along, they're talking. They don't have a clue what's going on. They're very much confused, but they're at least talking about it. They're not talking about how about them mariners. They're not talking about the weather. They're not just going back to, they're talking about these things. We're promised in the New Testament, Matthew 18, that where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is in the midst. And there's a great power among God's people to talk about these things. We need to do that. I've really appreciated this past year the Bergs who've opened their home and Some of you have participated in an opportunity to be there and talk about these things. It's a great thing to do, to gather in small groups or even just personal friendships and talk about the faith. And it's surprising how you'll sometimes feel that your heart is warmed up by that, that the sense that even Christ is there somehow. Here they are talking about these things, and all of a sudden Jesus shows up and says to them, now actually what it says is arene humen, which is peace to you, but I translated it hi because that was just the casual, everyday Jewish greeting. There was a more solemn kind of greeting that they would use in somewhat more formal occasions, or if you hadn't seen somebody for a while, or for whatever reasons you wanted to be somewhat more weighty in the greeting, then there was another formula you'd use. But if you just passed somebody, a friend of yours on the street, it was like the Italian ciao, or something, just kind of the standard casual greeting, and that's what Jesus uses here. So there's no great kind of solemnity or holiness about it in that sense. It's just, hi, peace to you. It didn't work. They were terrified, So there's another little subtlety in this verse that's interesting. Luke always speaks in very proper Greek. If you read in Greek Mark always tells, it's almost like stream of consciousness. Everything's in the present tense. And he goes here and he says that, and then this guy comes, and it's all present tense. It's like a movie playing in front of you, and Luke is much more proper. Everything's in the past tense, very, very nicely constructed. He's a very, obviously, master of the language. This is one of the rare exceptions. So literally it reads this way. And as they were talking about these things, he stood in their midst and he says to them, peace, Very unexpected. Some commentators think the reason Luke did that was, in a sense, to convey to us that Jesus continues to say it, that present tenseness is supposed to be taken by us, the people of God, as his ongoing greeting to us. He says it to us every day. He says it to us today. Peace to you, And that may be the case. So, they're the two very strong words for being completely astonished and fearful. They were overcome by their fear, thinking they were seeing a ghost. Now, you wonder about that. I mean, they've all just been talking about the fact that Jesus is alive. They've heard the report from the guys going to Emmaus. They've heard from Peter. They've heard from the women who went to the tomb. The word is out. And yet now when Jesus shows up, they're still overwhelmed with fear, Why does Luke tell us that? Probably, again, just to give us such an authentic picture of what really happened. He doesn't put a kind of silver kind of frosting on this or something, and they were enraptured in praise and something like that. No, they were terrified. It was a very human response, as I think we would be. We believe in the resurrection of Christ for sure, but if he walked in right now, I think we'd probably have a similar kind of response. Something about that is still just stunning to us. And so Jesus asked them, well, why are you terrified? Why are these thoughts arising in your hearts? You see my hands and my feet. Luke doesn't say this, but the other gospel writers do, that it's a reference to the wounds in his hands and his feet. You see my hands and his feet, and on that basis, ego eimi autos. It is I myself, is the force of that. This is quite important because Luke wants to chase off a heresy which has popped up again and again down through church history. It's a flavor of Gnosticism, and it was this idea that the person that came, appearing to be the resurrected Christ, was different from the Jesus who died, that this was a new being that came along. And you'll find traces of that even in some modern cults. Jehovah's Witnesses have something like this, not quite this, but something like it, where you have this kind of bifurcation between the Jesus who died and now this one who comes as a apparently resurrected Christ, and a separation of those two. Luke will not have that. He wants to leave us with no doubts whatsoever that this man who was standing before them was the same one that they saw laid in a tomb a few days earlier. The same one. Same, wounds in the hands, same prints in the feet. This is Jesus himself, who is in fact the same as the Christ of God. And they are one and the same, and the unity of this is to be clearly in our minds. So when we worship Jesus Christ, we're worshiping this one who was a true human being, and yet who conquered death in this way. He says, handle me and see, because a ghost, for Pete's sake, doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have. The word there for handle me is exactly the same word that John, the gospel writer, uses in 1 John, the first verse. You're familiar with this. 1 John 1:1, it starts this way. That which was from the beginning, which we have seen, which we have heard, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled. This is good, solid, I'm from Missouri, empiricism. This is not just believing some kind of lofty ideals that are true out there in some place that we can hardly access. This is the truth right here among us, inviting us to reach out and touch, you see. And I think probably John, in his letter, is remembering Jesus who said that very thing. Handle me, feel me, touch me. And it drives home once again the humanity of this resurrected Christ. And so we have this, having said this, verse 40, he showed them his hands and his feet. While they were still disbelieving in sheer joy and wonder, he said to them, and again this is very casual, what's in the fridge? What you got? We got anything to eat? That's the flavor of that. There's nothing more pretentious about it than that. What do you have to eat? And I can imagine almost with trembling hands, they handed whatever they've got, this broiled fish, and you can almost see the can't you just see the twinkle in his eye? He takes a big bite. No, not bad, good stuff. The resurrected Christ is having a piece of fish right there with his disciples. And whatever else we can get from this paragraph, we cannot lose the central point. This is the human Jesus, back from the dead. And what we learn about this, or what we learn from this about Christ, is that he continues to be this human being. When he ascended into heaven, he didn't ascend and evaporate. There is a true human Jesus, truly God, truly man, two natures, one person. That true humanity is true humanity. He's possessed of a physical body. It's a little different from ours. It's a resurrected body. It's not susceptible to death. It's not susceptible to disease, I don't know if it's able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. I don't know. I don't know what the powers of that. But one thing we should gather from it is that the promise of the New Testament is that we will share in this kind of wonderful, resurrected, state with him. He's the proof of that. And it gives us great confidence that as we look forward to, the end of life, at the same time, we look forward to something that is vastly better. The sufferings of this present time aren't worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed, Paul says in Romans 8, where he also speaks of the resurrection, the redemption, he says, of our bodies. So it's very encouraging to us. It gives us great hope and joy. I don't know if these bodies need to eat. I kind of doubt it. Wouldn't it be fun? I've thought about this. Should I say this? I don't know. Sometimes these things come to me in the middle of class, and then I think later. Have you ever gone to one of those wonderful brunches? And the biggest catastrophe of it all is you get full so fast. You just think, there's so many things I still want to eat. I'm just sick, Maybe that's one of the great powers of our resurrected bodies, You can not get full, and you don't gain weight. I mean, hey. I don't know. But fortunately, the Bible leaves us with a certain degree of studied silence about exactly what that body is like, lest I think we become too distracted reflecting on it. But anyway, he eats it right in front of them, and that drives home the point. All right, let's go to the next paragraph. He said to them, "These are my words, which I spoke to you while I was still present with you, that it was necessary that it be completely fulfilled, all that which is written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said to them, thus it stands written that the Christ must suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and that it be proclaimed on his name repentance and forgiveness of sins in all the nations, starting in Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I send you the promise of my Father. You remain in the city until you are clothed from on high with dunaman, with power. This, of course, overlaps similar instruction that we see in the book of Acts. This is where we see the two books, the two works, truly overlapping each other. A little difference, but a lot of similarity. All right, he said to them, these are the words that I spoke to you while I was still with you. So first thing, guys, recognize that this is not a novelty, some sort of unexpected development that wasn't already, in the works. I predicted several times that these things would happen. But now Jesus hooks his own prediction of these things back into the Old Testament. And he says that it was necessary that everything that's written, and notice he makes three references to the Old Testament, the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. This is the only time in the New Testament we have a full delineation of what the Jewish people in the first century regarded as their sacred scriptures. We call it the Old Testament. They just called it their Bible, their scriptures really. But you'll notice three categories here: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. We have various references to the Jewish scriptures in the New Testament. Often it's simply called the law, sometimes called the law and the prophets. This is the only time we have all three. This was, in fact, the complete corpus of Old Testament writings. The law referred to the first 5 books, the Pentateuch or the Torah. The prophets was actually a word that referred to what we call the histories, Ruth, Joshua, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and so on. Those were called the former prophets, and it also includes what were called the latter prophets, which would be what we otherwise call the prophets. I hope I'm not making this too confusing. So the Jewish Old Testament had what they called the former prophets and the latter prophets. Former prophets, what we consider the history, Kings, Chronicles, and so on. Latter prophets, what we call the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel. The Psalms refer to the wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, those books. Taken together, it's the entire Old Testament corpus. Conspicuous for its absence is the Apocrypha. No reference to the Apocrypha. That's not a compelling argument necessarily, it's just an observation. It'd be at best an argument from silence. But Jesus is referring here to what's called the Palestinian canon, which is the Old Testament canon that we as Protestants recognize. The Alexandrian canon of the first century included the Apocrypha, which you may be familiar with as part of the Roman Catholic Bible. The most restrictive canon in that day was the Samaritan canon. It was just the first 5 books. So Jesus here seems to be placing his imprimatur on this canon of the Old Testament that would be the one that we recognize. Although I don't want to build any monuments there, I'm just making that observation. More importantly, however, notice that he says here that all of this writing is about me. It's about Christ. All of the things that are written in all of these concerning me, he says. And it tells us that as students of the Old Testament, which we definitely should be, we should always be looking in the Old Testament for Christ. We should have a Christocentric reading of the Old Testament. Now, I mentioned to you last week, we're going to jump to the Old Testament this fall. We're going to go back and, Lord willing, we'll pick up with the book of Exodus. We did Genesis a few years ago. I've always wanted to come back and do Exodus, so we're going to do that. You have to promise to keep me honest, because I will tell you one of my temptations is to get off into the deep weeds when it comes to history stuff. I love it. But I'm going to want to take you through the 18th dynasty and what pharaohs were doing what and who was going where and who's dating who and so on, And after a while you go, yeah, but, what does it matter? And I have to say, I think it's a little bit helpful to know some of that stuff. I just get kind of juiced up about it, but you may not get so excited. And so I want you to keep saying, oh yeah, but what about Christ? Where do we find Christ in this? Because I guarantee you there's not a chapter that goes by in Exodus or anywhere else that we do not find Christ. And we need to be on the lookout. We are New Testament Christians, and that Old Testament is a rich heritage for us. I think it's very interesting to study it in light of its history, and I want to do a little bit of that with you because I think it actually bolsters our faith to see that it's describing sober history. But at the same time, we don't want to become so just, caught up in the historical detail that we forget what Jesus is saying right here. All of this, the law, the prophets, the Psalms, all of it is about Christ. And that's the one that we're going to be on the hunt for as we do our little study. But anyway, Jesus makes that comment here. He said to them, and then notice the little three-part discussion here. He said to them, thus it is written that the Christ must suffer and rise on the third day, and that on his name is the idiom, epi to anamati, on his name, repentance and forgiveness of sins be proclaimed in all the nations. So three little parts. First of all, the Christ must suffer. That may have been the bitterest pill in terms of the ancient understanding of Christ. This was the point where the Jewish mentality had the most heartburn. They didn't like an idea of a suffering Messiah. They had been expecting a conquering Messiah. They'd been expecting one who was going to come in like gangbusters, and we've, of course, reviewed that theme many times before. Jesus seems a little bit too much of a soft Messiah, and he certainly seems to suffer too much and hurt too much, To this day, that is a bit of a stumbling block with respect to Jewish individuals as they consider the Christian faith. They still have a hard time with a suffering Messiah. The book of Acts repeatedly describes how Paul was in conflict with his Jewish, kinsmen, compatriots, as detailed there, over the fact that the Christ must suffer. It was constantly a problem. And yet Jesus wants to make it clear that that's part of the Old Testament description of him. He'll be a suffering Messiah. He'll be one who goes through agony and pain. The Christ must suffer. You're my A student. You have to come up here. There's no other A students here. There we are. You have no idea. I've been lost this whole Sunday school lesson because you haven't been here. It's just, I tell you. This young lady is such a secure human being. She can put up with all of this grief I give her and do just fine. So, all right. So the first point has to suffer, rise from the dead on the third day. And of course, that becomes the proof that the suffering was effective. How do we know that Jesus didn't just die another tragic death? Many people have died tragic deaths in history. There's been great miscarriages of justice. How do we know this wasn't just another one? Because he came back from the dead. And the New Testament attaches to that unconditional importance. He's the one who was therefore extinguished the very claim of death upon us. Death, where's your sting? Grave, where's your victory? You see, and this is the proof for us. The proof in history. It's not just a philosophical idea, just a speculative notion. No, he comes back and proves it. And it's proof positive so that even if we're not so philosophically oriented, we have this deep, powerful proof that the death of Christ, the suffering of Christ was effective. And then the third part, which is what the book of Acts is going to be all about, this thing has to be proclaimed. It's going to be proclaimed, and the phrase here is on his name, not in his name. So commentators think that means on the weight or on the authority of his name. Repentance and forgiveness of sins in all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. And that's important because Acts starts in Jerusalem. Luke led us to Jerusalem. Acts takes us from Jerusalem. The first 9 chapters generally about Jerusalem. The rest of the book is taking us to the world, And Acts ends in a sort of just stops almost without a definitive conclusion. As if to say the story is still going on. We are a continuation of that story. So Luke just kind of gets the ball rolling and then lets us fill in the blanks, as now 2,000 years later, this church, this kingdom continues to grow. So it begins in Jerusalem, and he says, you are witnesses of these things. Then verse 49, and I send to you the promise of the Father, and you are to remain in the city until you are, the sense of the word here is endowed or actually clothed, from on high with dunamen, with dunamis, with power. I send you the promise of the Father. That's a theme that also is in Acts chapter 1. Clearly the promise of the Father here is referring to the coming of the Holy Spirit. In the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit is commonly called the Ruach Yahweh, the Spirit of the Lord. In the Old Testament, the Spirit of the Lord doesn't come on the majority of God's people, as you know. It just comes on a few, here and there. Anointed ones. A prophet here, a king there, a judge here and there, so on. That idea is that the Spirit of the Lord comes on the few who are given by that anointing the ability to do things beyond their normal powers. So you have these great Old Testament stories of people like Samson, and so on, who by the Spirit of the Lord do remarkable things. In Numbers chapter 11, there's this prayer that Moses prays in the story that unfolds there. And he says to Joshua, who's working under him, would that all God's people had his Spirit, that all of them were prophets, instead of just the few. But that prayer remains unanswered under the Old Covenant. But Joel, later, Joel chapter 2, picks up that prayer and makes it a concrete prophecy. Behold, the days are coming when I will pour out my Spirit on all my people. That idea. And so the prayer of Moses becomes the prophecy of Joel, and that's exactly how Peter construes the day of Pentecost. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he quotes that whole text. That's the promise of the Father. The great promise that had been held in abeyance all those centuries was that someday God would pour out his Spirit on all his people. And Jesus is now indicating to these the promise of the Father is coming. So you wait. Don't try to do this without this great strength and power that comes. Wait for the dunamis. Wait for the power. And that's what happened. Of course, the day of Pentecost then becomes the great realization of that promise. And then the last few verses. He led them out to Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. And it came about that as he blessed them, he was taken from them and carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they were constantly in the temple praising God, or blessing God, literally. He took them out as far as Bethany. Notice that Luke never tells us anything of his appearances in Galilee. Remember the other gospel writers, he goes up in Galilee, they do a little fishing thing, remember that? John tells us that, and so on. There's a lot of other things that happen. Luke doesn't want to... He is servicing his own view of this, which is everything goes to Jerusalem. Bethany's just a little outpost from Jerusalem. That's where the action is for Luke. He's not denying these other things, but he wants to make it clear that the great trajectory of his gospel has been to bring us to Jerusalem, and that's where these things happen. And so then he takes them out as far as Bethany. 40 days have gone by now, of course. And he lifted up his hands, blessed them. And as he blessed them, he departs from them, being carried up into heaven. This is called the Ascension. The Ascension in the New Testament is more than just Jesus going up. It's the technical sense of the word, which we often use to describe royalty. You might say, Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne of England in 1558. Use of the word ascend is not simply, to go up, but it's that idea of ascending to the throne. And that's the way the New Testament seems to contemplate the ascension of Christ. This is his coronation. He's just said to them, not here but elsewhere, all authority is given unto me. He's commissioned them. He's instructed them. And he ascends into clouds of glory. And we're promised in Acts chapter 1 that this same Jesus, who is now reigning, will return in like manner as we saw him go. This same Jesus, I assume the same nail prints in his hands, the same human who is both God and man, will return at some point, and we will join him at that time. So in the meantime, we're in this great business of proclaiming to the nations repentance and forgiveness of sins. So they return to Jerusalem. They are, with great joy, they are constantly in the temple, praising God with good reason. Amen. End of Luke. Well, my friends, it has been a real delight to have you with me this past couple of years. Some of you have been the whole route, so thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful, blessed summer. I hope you'll find your way back in the fall when we take a look at Exodus. Thank you. Thank you so much.